Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com. Ozcast.
Welcome to Strategicon.
Hello world, I'm John Bruni and you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. Mexico is not a country widely looked at through the lens of international relations, but being the United States' southern neighbor, it should be a country which demands further attention, since a broken Mexico will have huge impacts upon the US socially, politically, and economically. Of course, those familiar with the narco genre of entertainment on Netflix and other streaming services will be familiar with Mexico's reputation as a key supply and distribution point for the international drug trade, and the country has long been associated as a source of criminal activity. To discuss Mexico today, we are joined by returning guest Evan Ellis. Evan is a research professor of Latin American Studies at the US Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. Evan, welcome back to Strategicon.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Evan, let's start off with an obvious question. Cartels. Does the Mexican government regulate the cartels in any meaningful way, or do the cartels exercise undue influence on the government?
The answer is both. On the one hand, the Mexican government continues to act against the cartels in various different ways, although there are concerns that some cartels, such as the Sinaloa cartel, may be favored by the current government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador over others. And frankly, the situation with the cartels is getting increasingly out of control. On the one hand, you have the two major cartels, the long dominant Sinaloa with its international connections, sourcing in places like China and extending its distribution networks from Colombia through Europe and the United States and through the Americas, and also the increasingly powerful militarized rival, the Jalisco Nueva Generación cartel. But in addition to that, you have a total of about 300 different groups that to some degree fight against each other for control of the plazas, that are engaged in extortion, other types of drug operations. And so it's really both in terms of the violence, in terms of the question of, to what degree do the cartels have not only autonomy, but also influence on the Mexican government at the federal and state level. It's a very worrisome situation.
Which are the most influential cartels in Mexico today?
Within the past 2 to 3 years, the two that have emerged as the key are, again, the long dominant Sinaloa cartel and the relative newcomer, the Jalisco Nueva Generación cartel, which is estimated to operate in about 60 to 75% of Mexican territory, roughly equivalent to what Sinaloa is at.
I'm interested, Evan, in the rivalry between these two major cartels. If the state has any capacity to influence it one way or the other, I thought by now it would have been a divide and conquer strategy of going, all right, let's make a compromise deal with one cartel and go, if they understand there are some basic rules, they're going to make money, they're going to kill people, they're going to sell drugs, they're going to make drugs, but let's at least not have battles in the street between different cartels. Is it that the Mexican government can't reduce the number or doesn't want to reduce the number?
It's complicated, and there is a combination of collaboration and fighting. So in the days before Mexican former President Felipe Calderón took office in 2006, there was a certain level of permitting the cartels to operate behind the scenes as long as they kept the blood off of the streets. With the cartel situation getting out of control, you had the move, the deployment of both the Army and the Navy into states like Michoacán by the Calderón administration. And that really led to a dramatic escalation in the violence as well as the splintering of the cartels from about 3 major groups into about 7. And then you had the different armed wings of different cartels breaking off. You had armed gangs who were operating independently. So by this point, you now have roughly about 300 different groups. So the degree to which different groups can choose to collaborate or not is not as easy as it used to be. And frankly, there is a desire to collaborate. So Sinaloa has long been famous as a federated organization that really tried to avoid violence, although they had periodic spats with other traditional rivals, the Gulf Cartel, among others. But what's happened in recent years is while you have some level of collaboration, you also have these opportunistic attempts to advance one group or other's position at the margins via proxy wars. And so, for example, you have in places like Tamaulipas, groups such as the Gulf Cartel now acting as relatively a proxy for Jalisco Nueva Generación, and in some ways advancing against Sinaloa. Also, there is some uncertainty, again, the degree to which, given some signals that have recently come out, there may be some collaboration on the behalf of the Mexican government with Sinaloa, possibly trying to use friendly relations with Sinaloa to edge and gain ground, or at least push back against Jalisco Nueva Generación. So there's certainly a desire for collaboration, but the complexity means that there's just a constant breakdown in a series of rivalries.
North Korea likes to export meth around the world because they can't gain influence in other kinds of formal ways. Is there any kind of collaboration between cartels and the Mexican government in a similar kind of way, or is that just absurd?
Well, it's interesting that you bring up North Korea because one of the emerging important dynamics that we see with the advance of countries like China in Latin America is that you see increasing trans-Pacific criminal collaboration. So, for example, the Sinaloa cartel was one of the first ones that actually sourced things like ephedrine and pseudoephedrine, and of course, most recently, fentanyl in China, actually working with Chinese triad organizations, and then either taking it directly into countries like the United States or indirectly through Mexico. But you do see also a little bit of it going the opposite way. So you have some ties from the Sinaloa cartel to trying to get drugs into some of the outlying areas of China, as well as places like Hong Kong. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned North Korea as well, because one of the things that was very controversial that the Mexican Foreign Minister Miguel Ebrard recently did is, as part of AMLO's desire to return to symbolically being the leader of global leftism, or at least one of them, is express an interest for Mexico to recognize North Korea again. Now, it probably doesn't have to do with narco trafficking, but North Korea certainly does stay in the mix. And the other thing that's very important about your question is that right now in Mexican politics, there's a lot of controversy with respect to Mexico's president, as well as his Morena movement. But one of the deep amounts of concern is exactly that. What exactly are those relationships between the cartels and the government? So as an example, AMLO, there's a small town in Sinaloa called Badiraguato. And that happens to be the traditional hometown of the mother of one of Sinaloa's famous drug capos. But this town that had never seen a Mexican president visit before has been the recipient multiple times, including the president literally visiting the mother of El Chapo, largely without excuse. There have been other things that have happened as well that have raised a lot of suspicion. There was a solid U.S. drug case against one of the, actually against the leader of the Mexican army, Salvador Cienfuegos. The Mexicans convinced the U.S. to drop the case so he could be tried in Mexico. And as soon as he got on Mexican soil, they not only dismissed all the charges, but AMLO published in a very controversial way all of the charges that the Justice Department had put against Salvador Cienfuegos, putting sources and methods at risk. And there are other things. The national security law makes it much more difficult for U.S. DEA agents and others to operate in terms of the reporting requirements, in terms of taking away their immunity to operate on Mexican soil, in terms of forcing them to turn over any intelligence they have to officials who may themselves be compromised. So there are a lot of things that have been going on just in the past 2 to 3 years that have raised serious questions in Mexico and in the United States about the degree to which, exactly as you suggest, this government has been compromised by the cartels in one way or another.
Evan, how many people have died as a consequence of the continuing drug war in Mexico? And what sort of role does the purchasing of American weapons in the United States illegally by various people and then funneling them back into Mexico? What's the sort of dimension there that you can describe for our listeners, yeah?
That's a great question. So at least during the sexenios of Felipe Calderon and Enrique Peña Nieto, about 200,000 Mexicans died. The numbers are subject to wide debate depending on who you count. But again, it's not necessarily just directly at the hands of fights between drug gangs, but oftentimes it's spillover violence of those things. But it has certainly been a terrible price that is been paid. So this is an issue that the Mexicans they very much take to heart. Now, generally, the firearms are purchased legally in the United States. I mean, there are issues of waiting periods, and there are some areas where they may not be purchased perfectly legally. But the real problem is that what is illegal is the smuggling of those firearms into Mexico. And so obviously, especially some of the larger caliber, military grade firearms, AK-47s, AR-15s, and things like that, that oftentimes are used by the cartels to really, outgun particularly the Mexican state and local police, and sometimes even rival some of the capabilities of the Mexican armed forces. So every time that I have been in Mexico working with my Mexican colleagues, this is certainly something that they raise, as well as the fact that the Mexicans really see the continuing very strong demand for drugs. Clearly in the United States, even though obviously we've had over 90,000 people die of drug overdoses in the United States just this past year with methamphetamines, with fentanyl coming in through Mexico. The Mexicans point out that it's that demand that continues to fuel the violence. It's that demand and that money that's largely earned in the United States that finds its way back into Mexico, not only to buy the arms, but to corrupt the officials, to fuel this entire apparatus of violence. And so, the Mexicans are quite clear that it should be a shared responsibility. And generally, that's something that the U.S. has been on board about for quite some time. The question is, though, how much the responsibility do you share, and what does that mean?
Evan, it seems like such an impossible situation for just a normal Mexican person that on one hand, demand for drugs from the US hasn't declined. Therefore, there's always money to be made. Therefore, American weapons are necessary. So there's a constant flow of, drugs into and then out of Mexico, weapons into Mexico. What does a normal Mexican do to try and deal with this world? They've got nowhere to go other than to potentially try and cross the American border and at least live on the side where the level of violence is slightly lower. Like, how desperate is the situation getting for like a normal Mexican family?
That's actually a very important and fascinating question, because up until about a year or two ago, the reality, despite all of the numbers, despite 200,000 Mexicans killed during the past two sexenios, the reality was that for most Mexicans, Mexico was a reasonably well-functioning country. Although there was the perception oftentimes that the drug violence was for those who got mixed up in the gangs fighting against each other, and people that got awry of drug groups and the fights over the plazas. But other than in uncomfortable levels of corruption in public security forces and other things. In Mexico, it had a vibrant economy. It had a vibrant manufacturing sector with relatively good paying jobs. The people who lived in gated communities and other things at a certain level were generally relatively secure. The electricity generally functioned, the water generally functioned, far better than in many other countries in the region. If you weren't involved with drug issues, the legal system, although it had its defects, generally functioned. The civic registries, generally functioned. The highways were relatively good for transport. Now, little by little, that has fallen apart. Some of the violence more recently has extended, for example, into Mexico City, which used to be a relatively safe area, just dominated by gangs. Places that used to be considered sanctuaries, such as the beautiful state of Puebla, as well as, for example, Quintana Roo, subject to much of the tourist traffic, have become much less, safe than it used to be. But and certainly with the COVID-19, that has added a lot of pressures. But if you actually look at the immigration, it's generally the immigrants coming from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador coming through Mexico. And the net numbers of Mexicans in recent years actually were flowing back into Mexico because of some of the job opportunities that existed there. But little by little, it is becoming much more worrisome for all Mexicans. But despite everything you've heard, it's really, it hasn't been as bad for the Mexicans day to day. And I think that's part of what allowed the political pressures to be at least not worse than they currently are, because many Mexicans compartmentalized. They had the sense of, okay, this war is something that affects the state, that affects other people, but it doesn't as directly affect our daily lives. But that is beginning to change. And I think the frustration that brought Andres Manuel López Obrador and Morena to power, the frustration with the difficulties of the conventional parties, the PRI, the PAN, and the PRD, is now overflowing to a new level of frustration just with the level of bureaucratic administrative chaos, inefficiency, and frankly, craziness that has come in with this current government. So things are, as a famous author, Chino Achebe, once said, things are beginning to fall apart.
Evan, can you run through some of the Mexican government's notable victories against the cartels? I mean, is there any good news you can say?
It depends on what you call victories. The trajectory, ironically, looks a lot like what has happened in recent years in Iraq and Afghanistan with the U.S. fight against terrorist groups there. Because initially, the Mexican government, under Calderón as well as under Peña Nieto, went after cartel leaders. And the majority of the senior leaders of the main cartels, have been either arrested or eliminated. They almost had the equivalent of the famous U.S. Playing card, system in terms of about 120 different senior leaders who were targeted. Unfortunately, though, what had happened is that as those leaders were eliminated, groups such as the Zetas, groups such as the Gulf Cartel, groups such as La Familia Michoacana, groups such as the Caballeros Templares, groups such as the Beltran Leyva organization, they then fragmented into smaller, more violent groups with their own affiliated gangs. Those groups fought against each other for control. And so on the one hand, you could point to victories, and indeed also in other areas, Mexican's financial intelligence unit has done a decent job going after money of different groups. Again, if you look at some of the senior leaders, I mentioned before, El Chapo Guzman, the at least titular head of the Sinaloa cartel, who after his third escape from jail was recaptured and extradited to the United States. So there have been victories, as with the U.S. and Afghanistan and Iraq. The problem has been that the victories have, in some ways, made the situation worse than they have made it better in terms of violence, and that despite the victories, what you've had is a simultaneous process of fragmentation and consolidation. Fragmentation of many of the littler groups, but out of those littler groups, Again, Sinaloa and Jalisco Nueva Generación kind of emerging into this proxy war. And then recently, what has happened very sadly is that the new government coming in, the AMLO government, they, in order to try to get the police off the streets, get the military off the streets, which was a key pledge. They took probably the best functioning police organization in the country, the federal police, and they tried to eliminate the federal police and create this new National Guard. The problem was that the way it was put forward, not enough of the new police wanted to go into the Guard. It was seen as being run by the military. It was seen as not the type of organization that they felt good about being part of. And so when they didn't come into the Guard, you had the military ending up basically loaning military units to fill out the Guard ranks. And at the same time, the other big problems, the addressing of state police reform, which was badly needed, eliminating or at least bringing into better control some of the unruly local police units, which oftentimes end up working with the narcos. All of those things were kind of left as incomplete reforms. And so at the end of the day, instead of having the military off the streets, you have a new National Guard that doesn't have the chain of command that the military used to, but it doesn't have the community policing capabilities that the old federal police does. And frankly, it doesn't work with the same degree of good coordination that the federal police used to work with state and local forces. And if that wasn't bad enough, you also had a problematic civilian intelligence organization, kind of like the US CIA, called CISEN. And it was absolutely, yes, politicized. It was absolutely problematic in terms of both their analytical capability and the capability of some of their agents. But they created this new organization, the CNI, which had arguably more problems than CISEN, which it replaced. And so, and of course, then COVID hit. And so in many ways, one of the frustrations of the current government is they point out that not only do you have really the crippling of so many of or the key elements of fighting against the groups, but the policy of the new AMLO government, it's oftentimes it's made fun of, basically hugs not showering bullets at people, abrazos, no balazos. And the idea has been to try to be friendly and kind of work with the groups rather than just frontally attacking them, to try to get the violence down and get towards a solution. But the problem is that the groups have lost the fear of AMLO. And so as a result, you can say, well, maybe it was bad before that the country was taking down so many of the leaders and, fragmenting the cartels with violence. But under the current government, you have the cartels having become more powerful. And at the same time, the only major leader who's been taken down was a relatively obscure leader operating in the south of the country. So the worry is that, I work with and have very esteemed colleagues in both the Mexican Army and the Navy and in the police forces. And there's a lot of frustration. There are a lot of good people trying to do their jobs, but it is hard these days for the government really to point to solid advances under this sexennial of AMLO.
Evan, I've been looking into water kind of problems across the world, and I understand that the cartel steals quite a lot of water for growing like marijuana crops, and then you've got a lot of agricultural business like making beer and all that kind of thing who are using stacks of water, and that of course affects the food production and just the general population not being able to have access to an amount of water. How much complacency is there around those kinds of issues because of how confusing it might be? Are the corrupt politicians for water? Are the corrupt bureaucrats for water systems, owned by the cartel? Are they just kind of independent actors? How much kind of the complacency that there is around the problems with the cartel is down to just how shadowy these figures are?
Sure. Well, you make a good point, which is in general, it goes far beyond just drugs. Because, for example, you have some groups that are involved in exploiting immigrants who are coming through the country and coming through the territories that they control. And so it's not just the coyotes; it's who gets a piece of that. And of course, along with that, in places like Cancun, you have not just trafficking, but human exploitation, prostitution, and things like that. As you alluded to with the water issue, you have some issues of illegal mining, although that's actually a little bit worse in some other countries like Peru and the interior of Colombia and certainly Venezuela. But one of the other big problems is what they call huachacol, so the famous huachacoleros are, because Pemex is the national oil industry in Mexico, and AMLO insists on running everything through that industry. For years and years, people have been tapping into pipelines and robbing oil and also robbing refined gasoline products, either directly out of the refineries or from other manners. And there's active collusion at high levels from the people who are in Pemex. They've tried all kinds of stopgap solutions, trying to get the military out to patrol the routes for the pipelines, but it creates all kinds of issues. So on the one hand, there's a whole economy that's grown up around it. So there are so many truckers and other communities that are used to filling their tanks with half-priced gas. Entire communities who live off of essentially the economies that come out of the gas that's stolen. There are obviously environmental issues associated with the tapping into gas pipelines and things like that, and the contamination and the danger. And again, there's the whole issue of who controls and taxes all the subsidiary industries. And so you used to have one big cartel, San Rosa de Lima, that kind of owned a lot of that huachacol industry. The Zetas were coming in for a while. Now one of the big bad actors we talked about before, Jalisco Generación, the government basically came in and they really took down a big piece of the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel, but now it's replaced with Jalisco Generación. So you have that industry. If you get into Mexico City, the famous market of Tepito, where you have the Russians and the Koreans and the Chinese all involved in the contraband of illegal goods that are sold through that market in other parts of the country, and so they're involved in a piece of that. One of the new illegal industry that's emerged, especially in some of Mexico's major transit corridors, is the hijacking of trucks, and so trucking companies having to pay big money for safety. But for example, Mexico City to Veracruz is a famous place where just entire cargoes of trucks will be stopped by literally bands of groups of armored vehicles and roadblocks, and they will literally take the truck off the trailer and drive it away, or empty its contents and drive the contents away. And so what's happened is, you're absolutely right, it's not just the narco economy, it is this overlapping series of criminal economies that affect and distort all of the parts of the country, with impacts in the justice system, on environment, on the way people live, and many other things. And so it's a very good point that you make.
Evan, to continue the economic theme, so much of the Mexican economy, from what we can see from the Australian perspective, is US companies outsourcing to lower labor cost. So there was a flow of an economy as the US hits harder economic times and it can't afford to buy those products. It appears much of Latin America is more likely to buy Chinese products than Mexican products because they'll be cheaper again. What's happening to sort of that transplanted US industrial economy? Is it still stable, or is it starting to look particularly shaky?
And that's an interesting question, because there's been quite a bit of back and forth. And so you had a period some years ago when a lot of political discussion in the United States about U.S. manufacturing jobs going to Mexico, especially after NAFTA in 1994, when you had the creation of the whole maquiladora industry, especially focused on the north of Mexico, with factories producing subcomponents and things, or even final assembly to go into the United States. Now, recently, what began to happen then is, as the Chinese came in with lower labor, it wasn't just Chinese products competing against Mexican products, although that certainly did happen. The Mexicans began to adapt, in part by integrating Chinese components into Mexico-U.S. value chains, at least to the extent that it was permitted by NAFTA. And so if you look at the textile industry, the famous yarn to garment value chain, and bringing certain things in from China as a way for Mexican textile producers to be able to survive. interestingly, similar things have happened in Colombia and other places in the region, also incorporating the Chinese part. The Chinese had begun in places like Veracruz with Foton to integrate themselves into the automotive industry, among other industries. Now, as you had that movement away from Mexico, or at least that integration, of course, it was a big wake-up call what happened with the shutdown of Wuhan, with the explosion of COVID-19, because not only Wuhan, but with all of China, that seriously, as you know, interrupted many of those supply chains that had come from China. And that really revived the whole argument of what they call nearshoring here in the United States. The argument that, does it really make sense to have these, trans-hemispheric, really stretched out value chains just because we can ship containers around the world relatively cheaply? Doesn't it actually isn't there a certain value of proximity in terms of suppliers and just-in-time and security for, dealers in the United States? And in many ways, Mexicans and others in Central America have kind of looked at that, saying, hey, how do we leverage that to increase our appeal? Because, our labor rates are not that much out of sync, especially with coastal China. And so how do we, how can we take advantage of this? Unfortunately, just because of some of the chaos within the Mexican government and their economics ministry, as well as, frankly, in many of the Central American governments, they have not. It's been an interesting idea, nearshoring, but the reality of actually making that happen has not proceeded forward. So we'll see how it works out. So I think we're still going to continue to see a strong role of China in these value chains, but there certainly is some desire to bring at least a certain amount of things for the security of production operations, for the resilience of production operations, back closer to the United States. And maybe Mexico can benefit if Mexico is able, under USMCA to really kind of get its act together.
Evan, the current Mexican president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, otherwise known as AMLO, isn't he? He's AMLO. He seems to be a very left-leaning figure ideologically. So returning to what you had initially said about him, how has this affected contemporary Mexican foreign policy?
It's a great question. And the interesting thing is that there's been quite a bit of debate of where AMLO was really on the political spectrum. And so in many ways, he used to be what we would say in the United States is an old kind of Chicago party boss, kind of labor machine politician. So again, it used to be the mayor of Mexico City. And so then when he was head of, he was part of their the PRD at that time, kind of the left leaning of the three. So he was seen as pragmatic rather than ideologically radical. Now, over the years, he seems to have drifted farther to the left, and of course, after he pulled out of the PRD and formed this new, more dispersed movement, Morena, and after he's now come to power. Little by little, he's been going farther and farther to the left. But in many ways, it's seen as kind of a return to the 1970s, almost in the same way that Joe Biden in the United States is seen as kind of a part of a left that, existed 40 years ago, but still had a certain conservative element to it. And so, you see AMLO saying, okay, we want to use the Mexican national oil company, Pemex, despite its problems, for national oil production. We want to use the Mexican power and electricity organization, the CFE, to channel all power generation, despite some of the problems with that. And as you pointed out, Mexico had a tradition, once again, in a very different world back in the 1970s with Luis Echeverria, of trying to kind of lead the left. This was the time when Mexico had a policy of supporting Cuba, being open to Fidel Castro, having, helping sponsoring negotiations by the then rebel movement, the FMLN in El Salvador. They're working with the Cubans. And so Mexico took a certain amount of pride of being kind of a leader of the Latin American left, much to the consternation of the United States. And what you see is almost in a weird kind of out of time way, AMLO and his once relatively moderate foreign minister, Miguel Ebrard, has been moving in that direction. They've, as I mentioned before, declared a desire to open a dialogue with North Korea that had been shut off under the previous government. They declared that, Cuba, with all of the repression, as we saw recently on June 9th against its own population, was a wonderful example of resistance to U.S. hegemony. They argued for the basically the elimination of the Organization of American States. And so there are kind of quaint, out of time things that are coming out of this government, frankly, that have not been seen as entirely productive. And the irony of it all was, for those of us who really value U.S.-Mexican relations and security cooperation, the under Donald Trump, when the Trump administration was sometimes insulting Mexico in the worst possible ways, forcing or obliging Mexico to hold Central American migrants on its side of the border, talking about the border wall, AMLO was silent, much to the consternation of internal politics. Now, with a much more receptive, accommodating, President Biden and Kamala Harris, AMLO has become, much more assertive and bitter. And frankly, as somebody who works in the security arena, one of the most worrisome aspects of that isn't just these 1970-ish foreign policy pronouncements, but frankly, it's the new Mexican national security law, which significantly cuts our ability to work with Mexico on issues such as narco trafficking and going after these groups, and things that are important, like guns, et cetera, et cetera. And so at the end of the day, that creates a security problem for all of us, because, if we can't work with Mexicans effectively, if they have their internal problems in terms of the power of these groups, at the end of the day, the repercussions go against Mexico, and the repercussions come against the United States, where, again, we had over 90,000 people die of fentanyl overdoses last year.
AMLO's left-leaning politics, how has this affected Mexican non-narcotic private sector interests? Is this something of a popular measure, or is there resistance at the private sector level to a lot of what Obrador is putting forward?
It's interesting. AMLO has become increasingly unpopular in Mexico. He's had certain, I think, constituencies who agreed with him and who were aligned with him, again, because of the politics he represented, because he was seen as sincere and decent and straight talking, although he could be a bit of the bumbling grandfather at times. But he was very tight with the unions, and he was very tight with the teachers union, et cetera. But certainly in the business community, there's been a lot of frustration. It's again with some of the actions with respect to power, with some of the actions with respect to the oil sector. The Mexican economy itself, which even before COVID was expected to marginally recover, had almost flat growth. He reformed or tried to reform the medical sector even before COVID, and now you have problems in getting access to cancer drugs. He canceled a $19 billion major airport project that was badly needed, and it had been more than a decade in the works, and then tried to substitute a series of smaller airports, and then those projects, such as famously the Santa Lucia airport, got messed up, and then he's trying to bring the Mexican military in to help administer that now. With respect to USMCA, which NAFTA was kind of reformulated into that, there have been issues with perceptions that those accords have been violated, although it's been there's been relative silence and an attempt to work through that on the U.S. side. So my sense is that just with respect to the frustrations of the Mexican government, and the frustrations go farther because there's the sense of let's call it administrative drift. Okay, he promised to get the military off the streets. They're not off the streets. He promised, and these are things that were important to the left. He promised to, get violence down. Violence hasn't come down. He promised to, the hugs, not sprays of bullets, has almost become a matter of ridicule. So I think a lot of people have become very, very, very disillusioned with him. And then, of course, COVID. He managed basically on the one hand to try to keep the Mexican economy alive by resisting the shutdowns and some of his own politics. But if you look at what's happened with COVID right now, Mexico has one of the highest mortality rates in the country that used to have a pretty good health system. So just as an example, Argentina has about 5 million COVID cases, about 100,000 COVID deaths. Mexico has far less cases, has about 3.1 million COVID cases, but almost 3 times as many COVID deaths, 248,000 COVID deaths. I mean, the lethality rate is really high. Their rate of vaccination, I think it's now in the 20 percentile, range. And so there's a sense that, especially with the Delta variant, COVID is ravaging the country. Death rates relatively high. We're still not out of this. So, people are frustrated that the economy wasn't shut down fast enough. People are frustrated that things weren't done. So there absolutely is a sense. There are those who still identify, I think, with AMLO of he's our guy, especially because Mexicans are even more disillusioned with the established 3, relatively corrupt, inefficient parties. But at the end of the day, there's just a lot of, I think, frustration in Mexico with where things are going with AMLO and the associated drift.
David?
Evan, if there's so many problems building with the United States' ability to work with Mexico because of AMLO, what impact is he having on relations with southern neighbors? So, for example, things like the Pacific Alliance, where they were trying to move forward and find ways to work effectively together. Is that unraveling at the moment because of AMLO?
I mean, my sense is that within the Mexican Foreign Ministry, although Miguel Ebrard is a relatively bright guy and is relatively competent in that sense, but I have not seen indications that either from Mexico or from other major actors that the Pacific Alliance has taken major steps forward. And that's somewhat understandable just because Latin America, even more than Asia, is just mired right now with the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, Colombia is a mess with both COVID and protest violence, as well as the fiscal crisis, as well as the FARC, as well as Venezuelan refugees. Peru is in the middle of the throes of having just elected this relatively unknown leftist Pedro Castillo from kind of the hinterlands and amidst a conservative yet fragmented Congress and lots of worries among conservative actors like the military. Chile is in the middle right now of its major of a constituent assembly and looking at elections coming up in November. And so if you look at the major actors who used to be relatively stable and conservative and pushing this pretty neat thing, the Pacific Alliance, forward, all of those actors, frankly, are in greater or lesser states of disarray and internal turmoil. So, I don't think it's the Pacific Alliance is dead, but I think, all of the major players are a bit distracted right now in Latin America.
The Trump administration scrapped NAFTA. How has this advantaged U.S.-Mexican trade and economics?
My sense, honestly, is there have been modest improvements. And the irony is that, in my personal judgment, NAFTA was never that bad of a deal. It needed some modernization in intellectual property and in other areas. And ironically, the difference between NAFTA and USMCA is mostly things that were borrowed from TPP and some of the goodness that had come out of that. And so in many ways, the irony is that we walked away from TPP, but we grabbed some pretty neat ideas from TPP and slapped it on top of NAFTA. And now we have a slightly better NAFTA deal. The problem really is that, right after we implemented USMCA, of course, shortly thereafter, you had, COVID hitting. And also just with the New Mexican political environment, there have been some issues of violence, there's some issue of violation of the accords. And so there are some administrative uncertainties, but in general terms, USMCA as a follow-on to NAFTA is, from what I've seen, is doing okay.
Evan, it may not be an easy question to answer because it's a bit of a crystal ball question, but if AMLO is losing the support of the population gradually and hasn't found a way to reduce the level of violence, is there someone in the wings who seems like the next logical, president, or is it just lots of people squabbling in the background at the moment?
That's a great question, and frankly, it's wide enough open right now just because of the persistent weakness of the traditional three parties, that the PRI and the PAN and the PRD, and they all have people who are waiting in the wings, but it's not clear that there is one or two kind of key alternatives to AMLO, and of course elections are still a ways away. One of the things that I will say is that despite the just level of concern over things that are going wrong and just how quickly things have gone south, Mexico is actually a relatively advanced economy, a relatively functional economy with a relatively good infrastructure, a pretty good pharma sector, a pretty good tech sector, a pretty good manufacturing sector, a pretty well-educated, sophisticated management elite. And frankly, Mexico is for all of its difficulties, a pretty resilient democracy with strong traditions of freedom of expression and assertions of rights and things like that. So there's a lot of frustration in Mexico, not unlike the polarization and difficulty that you see for different reasons in the United States. But I'm hopeful that Mexico is proceeding smartly toward a new election with traditional parties, that we may see the pendulum swing back a different way. So I think it's a testament to the resilience of Mexico that we're not yet at the point where we're talking about, extra political solutions or new, even more populist leaders. I think Mexico will pull back from this, but it's going to take time, and there's going to be a lot of pain, and I think there's going to be a lot of concern on the U.S. side, just because of everything that is implied by a violent, chaotic, dysfunctional Mexico.
How does Washington seek to counter growing Chinese influence, both strategic and criminal, in Mexico?
That's a great question. And it's interesting because on the one hand, Mexico, for a number of structural and cultural reasons, has not been a big player with respect to China. China has had an important presence, but in general, even the Mexican left, even AMLO himself, has been very reluctant. And also because of Mexico's proximity to the United States and the economic integration through NAFTA, now USMCA, you have a lot of key actors with a stake in the U.S. economy. You have a lot of production and the supply chains that were committed to the U.S. economy. Mexican oil production, for example, is largely committed to this hemisphere. Mexican agricultural production is largely committed to this hemisphere. And so, there was never really a lot to be gained by the Chinese coming in and doing these mega projects. And when they have things like, for example, you had a big project in Quintana Roo a couple of years ago, which was going to be called Dragon Mart. There was a lot of pushback against Mexicans who saw this as a threat to their leather industry, to their manufacturing industry, and things like that. The thing that worries me, though, is despite that, and despite the fact that you do have some Chinese manufacturing, for years, China has had a modest presence, for example, Foton and previously Fa in the car industry, or Hutchison Whampoa operating about 6 projects in the port infrastructure sector. So China was not unknown in Mexico. Indeed, China Offshore Oil Corporation had a presence in the Perdido block, one of the offshore oil blocks. However, AMLO, because of his relatively anti-market policies and because he's been pushing Western investors out, has little by little been backing himself into a corner where he is becoming more dependent on Chinese investors. And so, for example, his signature Southern train infrastructure project, the famous train Maya, the Chinese company China Harbor and CCCC has playing a major role there in conjunction with a firm called Mota Engel, and will probably have an expanded role. One of the big refinery projects called the Dos Bocas refinery in Mexico is being financed, very importantly, by the Chinese. And other Western investors are very reluctant to put more money into Pemex, good money after bad. And on top of that, Mexico, although little known, has a pretty significant new lithium field under development in the Sonora Desert called Bacanora. And the Chinese just recently came in and grabbed the entire project. They started out with a minority stake and now have the whole project. And indeed, in the clean energy sector, in terms of especially wind and solar, it's interesting that a company, Zuma Energy, was recently bought out by the Chinese. The suspicion being that the reason the Chinese wanted to get in the energy sector while everyone else is getting out is they believe that they're going to get special treatment. So at the end of the day, ironically, you have a Mexican left and a Mexican leftist president who has long been suspicious about the Chinese, but little by little, he's becoming more and more dependent on Chinese investors in Chinese projects. It's still not an enormous presence, but from my perspective of how that translates into political influence as AMLO's other options run out, do cause me some concern.
Well, everyone, that's a wrap. My thanks to our special guest, Dr. Evan Ellis, for again joining us on Strategicon. My thanks also to co-host David Olney and Strategicon producer Tim Whiffen for being with us today, and thanks to the Ozcast Network. Our audience, thanks for listening. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to the audio version of Strategicon through the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. And please like us on the Sage International Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. You can also watch our podcasts on video through the Strategicon Raw YouTube channel when they are available, easily accessed by clicking on the link provided on our website. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. If you would like to support Strategicon, remember to hit the like button on our social media channels, and please give us a review on your favorite podcasting platform. Until next time, goodbye.
Head into your local Safeway for great spring savings throughout the store. This week at Safeway, get yellow peaches or nectarines for the member price of $1.88 per pound. Also this week at Safeway, value packs of Signature Farms chicken drumsticks, thighs, leg quarters, or picnic packs are buy one, get one free. Plus, get value packs of USDA choice boneless beef top sirloin steak for the member price of $4.99 per pound. Visit Safeway.com, download the Safeway for You app, or head in store to find more great deals at Safeway.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.